Welcome to the second part of Mazda Tribute or Ford Escape transmission removal video. In the previous video we covered required tools, draining fluids, removed battery, air filter box and starter, disconnected all the wiring, and unbolted the top of the transmission from the engine and the frame. In today's video, we're getting underneath the vehicle in order to unbolt the rest of the transmission and remove it from the vehicle completely. Now, with the vehicle up in the air, fluids drained and splash shields removed, the first thing I'm going to do is remove drive axles. Starting with the driver's side, remove axle nut. It is a 32mm socket. If you don't own one, you can rent it from a chain part store like O'Reilly for free, basically. Now, if you don't have an impact gun, you can use a breaker bar and have an assistant use a pry bar to hold the hub in place so you can break the axle nut loose. Or you can also knock out the center cap of the wheel and place it back on the car, and with the wheels on the ground, break it loose that way. With the axle nut off, your axle should slide inside the wheel hub nice and easy. If it doesn't move, use a rubber mallet to break the axle loose from the hub. That way you don't damage the threads on the axle. Next, remove the pinch bolt. With a wrench on one side and a socket on the other, the nut comes right off. Then a few taps with a rubber hammer and the pinch bolt is out. And now we are ready to disconnect the lower control arm from the knuckle. I have a tool designed specifically for that. If you don't, you can use a regular pry bar and a chain around the control arm, like this. You may have to add a little bit of hammering to the downward pressure you create with your tool. And there we go. Bingo. With the lower control arm disconnected, move the knuckle out of the way and pull the axle out of the hub. Using a pry bar, pop the axle out of the transmission, and the axle is out. Repeat the same steps for the other side. Axle nut, pinch bolt, disconnect lower control arm, pull the axle out of the hub. Then all you need to do is remove these two 13mm nuts, and the axle slides right out. Now, with both axles removed, the next thing we're going to do is remove the exhaust pipe. In order to do that, first thing we need to do is remove this cross brace. There are four 15mm bolts holding it. With the cross brace out of the way, we can start removing the exhaust pipe. There are two bolts right here, two right here that I'm going to remove last, and two right here. Also, disconnect this rubber hanger right here. And this oxygen sensor needs to be unplugged right here and unclipped right there. Spraying all the exhaust bolts with some penetrating oil before breaking them loose will definitely make your job a lot easier. Now, the whole pipe is being held by the two nuts in the middle. Remove those and the whole pipe comes out. As it turned out, one of the studs had been broken and replaced with a regular bolt and nut, which happens quite often with exhaust bolts. With the exhaust pipe out of the way, we can start removing our exhaust manifold, axle bracket, and alternator. First, using a 3/8 drive ratchet, remove the drive belt from the alternator pulley and place it out of the way. Next, loosen the two alternator bolts. Then, pry off this plastic bracket right underneath the alternator. This will help us get the third alternator bolt right here. The easiest way to access it is through here, right by the exhaust rubber hanger. There is a straight shot. Just use a long extension and the bolt comes right out. With the top bolt out, let's remove the bottom two and place the alternator out of the way. It is not going to come out yet. With the alternator out of the way, the next thing we need to do is remove this alternator bracket. It is held by three 10mm bolts, right here, and right there. Now, let's move this O2 sensor connector out of the way, and the bracket comes right out. Here is a better view of it for your reference. Next, we'll be removing the exhaust manifold. So let's disconnect this oxygen sensor connector and this EGR pipe, which you can access from right here. I'm using a 1 1/16 wrench, which is a little big around the nut, but it's the closest one I have and it's plenty long to provide good leverage to break this nut loose. In the first video, I loosened the other side of this pipe at the EGR valve to make sure the whole pipe moves around and out of the way freely when I'll be removing the manifold. Now, after disconnecting the O2 sensor and EGR pipe, we can remove the exhaust manifold nuts. There are 6 nuts, 13mm in size, 3 right here, 1 more right there, that one, and 2 more around the oxygen sensor. I had to use a bore scope camera to fit in here, so I apologize about the image quality. For some nuts, you're going to need a wrench. For others, a deep socket with a long extension and maybe a swivel adapter. Definitely a good idea to spray them all with some penetrating oil. In my case, all of the nuts came out with the studs. That's why you see holes in the head instead of studs. It is a tight spot, but the manifold should come out. If the manifold doesn't want to come out, you can either play with raising and lowering the engine from engine support, or move the manifold out of the way like we did with Alternator and move on to the next step, removing the axle bracket. Axle bracket is held by 6 bolts. 4 right here and 2 more right here. They are T50 Torx drive. The bracket is slotted right there, so that bolt doesn't have to be removed, just loosened. Here is a better view of the bracket for your reference. If you weren't able to remove the exhaust manifold before, now it will definitely come out. Also, if you're replacing the alternator, now you can finally remove it. Just take the nut off and disconnect the connector. The battery has to be disconnected, obviously. For installation, reverse the removal procedure. And we are moving on to the next step. PTO unit. It is held by 4 bolts, 3 right here. They are external Torx, E14, and 1 more coming from the other side, regular 14mm. We also need to disconnect the drive shaft, which is held by 6 bolts. They are T45 Torx drive. You can either hold the drive shaft with a pry bar like this to break them loose, or you can manually switch between park and neutral to break all of the bolts loose. Mark the drive shaft in relation to the PTO unit and disconnect it. Then remove the 14mm bolt on one side of the transfer case and the 3 bolts on the other side. Make sure to press the PTO unit towards the transmission when you are removing the last bolt. Once all of the bolts are removed, pull it away from the transmission. It is pretty heavy, so be prepared to catch it. Next, we're going to remove the torque converter nuts. Right here at the back of the oil pan, there is an opening. You might have a cover in there, so take that out. And then right here at the front of the engine, I will put a socket on this crankshaft pulley bolt and turn the engine over to align the torque converter nut with the opening, like this. Torque converter nuts are 15mm, and as I am trying to loosen one, I am holding the crankshaft from spinning with the other ratchet. Repeat the same process until all of the nuts are removed. And now, all we have is 4 bolts holding the engine and the transmission together. 1 bolt right here by the knock sensor, 2 more at the oil pan, and 1 more behind this cross brace. So I'll get the first 3 loose. Then remove the cross brace. First goes this mount nut. Then this 18mm nut at the back and 2 15mm bolts at the front. Don't forget the motor mount bolt. And all we have now is unclip these O2 sensor wires from the bracket, disconnect transmission cooler lines. There is the last bolt that was hiding behind the cross brace. And it's a good idea to remove this output shaft speed sensor, which is held by an 8mm bolt. Always make sure to flush out your transmission cooler lines before you install a new transmission. You just push this fluid into one line until it starts to come out the other side. But for now, I'll just pinch them off with my pinching tools so I don't have to work around this fluid dripping all over me. As always, links to all the tools will be in the description. Next, I'm going to remove this 15mm nut and then unscrew the nut from the other side. In order to hold the stud in place, we will need an external Torx socket size E8. Now I can lower the transmission side and raise the engine side using my engine support and place a transmission jack underneath. Secure the transmission to the jack with a strap. Check it from up top to make sure I didn't accidentally catch any wires or hoses along with the transmission. With the transmission secured to the jack, we can remove the last 3 bolts. The one by the knock sensor is longer than the other 2. And now, with a fair share of wiggling, prying, tilting, yanking, and pulling, we get here. I cannot go lower because it is already sitting on the frame. But if I want to slide it to the side, I have this piece for the transfer case running into the flex plate. So if you run into something like this, play with the engine angle from up top until eventually your transmission becomes free. Make sure to keep checking for wires and hoses being caught from the top and pulled down with the transmission. And finally, the transmission is out. A couple things I want to point out. This transmission doesn't have a flat surface on the bottom, so I had to use a block of wood to keep it stable. I could place it towards the front of the transmission or here towards the back. I made the mistake of placing it towards the front, thinking that once I strap it down hard enough, it won't move. But it did. And what it caused is my torque converter studs got hung up on the flex plate. And when I pulled the transmission away from the engine, the torque converter popped out of the transmission and started leaking. If you get caught in something like that, you may have to use a pry bar to separate the torque converter from the flex plate. Finally, I switched the block of wood towards the back of the transmission, which helped to keep it level with the engine, and the transmission came right out. I hope this helps. Give it a thumbs up if this video made sense. Comment down below what transmission experiences you had. Thank you for watching. Good luck and take care.